Hi everyone, I'm Jack Remling, Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on Vineland by Thomas Pynchon, published in 1990, the follow-up to Gravity's Rainbow with all of its technical virtuosity, and a book that's suffused with the humor and the pop culture associations that were in Pynchon's three previous novels. But a book that I imagine many were disappointed by when they first encountered it. I was maybe just able to read the smallest board books when this book was published, and so I came to it more than a decade later after I'd read Against the Day. And I think that's why I'm able to connect with Vineland and appreciate what Pynchon's doing, while recognizing it's not the masterpiece that is Gravity's Rainbow or Against the Day or even probably Mason and Dixon. But there is something crucial in Pynchon's body of work that he really gets at in Vineland, and I think he gets at for the first time and returns to with Against the Day. And that is his ability to focus on family, to embrace this sense of there are people we value in our lives. And we had sort of seen that in his earlier works, but here it's crucial that people are willing to completely throw over their lives, not for an idea, not for a conspiracy, not for some idea, but rather for another person, for the value that they find in a relationship. That is what they will just completely turn everything over for, and value above all else. And there's a beating heart at the core of Vineland that is utterly compelling, and that I think Pynchon then returns to with Against the Day and expands out into a real masterpiece there. But within Vineland, we still get all of the little jokes and the pop culture references, the hyperactive free association. There are so many just stuffed into these pages. But it is not a book that is out to build this world with language and words that no one has ever heard of, and to develop metaphors that seem so beyond the common reader of Johnson or Wolfe or anyone else, the common reader's capability. This is a book that is utterly accessible and that really continues to develop some of the themes Pynchon had worked at in Crime of Lot 49 or in Gravity's Rainbow or even V. This is not a book that rejects revolution or conspiracy. It rather refocuses those choices and says that for some people, their revolution is finding a relationship they value and doing anything they can to protect that and value it. That their revolution is turning around and turning their life over in some new or even horrifying way to embrace a person or a friend or a lover or a child that means more to them than anything else, than everything they valued. And we see across these pages different examples of that, sometimes in tragic examples of that, sometimes hilarious examples of that. And I think that's what Vineland really gets at. It is perhaps, at the time it was published, it was probably the most human of Pynchon's novels. And it's a humanity that he was able to retain throughout the subsequent works he would publish. And so I think that's why I connect with it, that's why I value it, that's why I love it. It is a strange book. It is perhaps in some ways his most political book, while not necessarily trying to be a political book like explicitly. He is constantly dropping in these brilliant passages examining what is happening in society. It's set in the 1980s, it's set in 1984, published in 1990, written between the early 70s and its publication date. And throughout the book, Pynchon is constantly sort of turning his mind and our focus towards what is happening around him. How did the United States become this consumer-focused, avaricious society with product name drops, with entertainment that feels mind-numbingly stupid, and how did so many people embrace that and just become more than happy to wallow in it? There's something where Pynchon is trying to grasp at how did so many people reject what he had valued, or what the ideas he was exploring in his books in the 1960s and in the early 1970s. And a decade on, how on earth has everyone just sort of turned around and said, no, actually, I want to go in that direction, and I'll do plenty of things to keep going in that direction. And so those passages are fascinating throughout the book. But it is a book that is also very scattered and sort of all over the map, and not in the way that Against the Day is, where it's explicitly sort of postmodern and working with different styles. There is really only one style in Vineland, but it is a narrative that's jumping about and very discombobulated at times. So I did want to read a couple of passages that get at what Pynchon is able to accomplish in this book. So this comes from later in the book, with the characters on a trip. It says, crossing the Golden Gate Bridge represents a transition in the metaphysics of the region, there to be felt even by travelers unwary as Zoid. When the bus full of northbound hippies first caught sight of it, just at sundown as the fog was pouring in, the towers and cables ascending into pale gold otherworldly billows, you heard a lot of wow and beautiful. Though Zoid only found it beautiful the way a firearm is, because of the bad dream unreleased inside it. In this case, the brute simplicity of height, the finality of what swept below relentlessly out to sea. They rose into the strange gold smothering, visibility down to half a car length, prairie standing up on the seat gazing out the window. Heading for nothing but trees, fish, and fog, slick from here on in, sniffling. Till your mama comes home, he wanted to say, but he didn't. She looked around at him with a wide smile. Fiss. Yeah, fog. Trees. Zoid must have dozed off. He woke to rain coming down in sheets, the smell of redwood trees in the rain through the open bus windows. Tunnels of unbelievably tall, straight, red trees, whose tops could not be seen, pressing in to either side. Prairie had been watching them all the time, in a very quiet voice talking to them as they passed one by one. It seemed now and then as if she were responding to something she was hearing, and in rather a matter-of-fact tone of voice for a baby too, as if this were a return for her to a world behind the world she had known all along. The storm lashed the night, dead trees on slow log trucks reared up in the high beams, shaggy and glistening. The highway was interrupted by flooding creeks and minor slides that often obliged the bus to creep around inches from the edge of totality. Aisle-mates struck up conversations. Joints appeared and were lit. Guitars came down from overhead racks and harmonicas out of fringe bags. Then soon there was a concert that went on all night, a retrospective of the times they'd come through, more or less, as a generation. The singing of rock and roll, folk, Motown, 50s oldies, and at last, for about an hour just before the watery green sunrise, one guitar and one harmonica, playing the blues. And there are so many things happening in that passage. The idea that at the end, the blues is something that this character is remembering himself feeling. He's blue in the present, remembering how on earth his life has led to this point, and he's remembering a time in his past on this journey where he was also feeling blue with this sense that the short marriage and life he had built for a few months and years is now over in a sense, and he is transitioning into this new phase. So there's that aspect. There's the layers of moving into the past. The music moves into the past. The characters seem to move into the past in a way, and to escape the trap of the present. But they're also moving into a landscape with the giant redwoods that are trees that are in a sense prehistoric, trees that have not they themselves have been around for millions of years, but trees that as a species have been around for millions of years, that they are sort of this landscape that feels in the past and otherworldly, having been there and experienced the redwoods of California. Like there is something different there. There's a different life among those trees. You feel that you're on Earth, but not necessarily on the same Earth that you've spent the rest of your life at. And Pynchon is capturing that for Zoid and for Prairie and for the reader, if the reader can catch that association. But the way that he starts it as well, that there's this transition about crossing the Golden Gate Bridge, this famous symbol. And for Zoid, it's almost this like dark nihilistic symbol. And we see the way his attitude changes through his association with Prairie as a toddler, sort of, recognizing the changes and that there could be some hope. And the way that the music then sort of creates this calming and nostalgic atmosphere and pulls him out of that dark despair in a sense that he has when they're on the bridge itself and what it symbolizes for him. So I think that's just like this incredible passage Pynchon puts into the book where he earns it, he builds out these ideas, he pushes forward with what with what a character can experience in just a couple of paragraphs. So what is actually happening in Vineland? As I said, it's all over the place. It is ostensibly we are introduced to Zoid Wheeler, a man who, as part of his disability benefits, must throw himself through a glass window every year to demonstrate that he requires these disability payments, and that is what he is living off of. There's a sort of Joseph Heller Catch-22 vibe going on there. We ultimately learn how this started, like what happened to what was going on for Zoid when he did that for the first time. And I won't spoil that for readers who haven't read the book. But there's a darker past to that than just the reality of seeing, people who are mentally ill or who do live strictly off of disability payments like that. There's something even deeper going on within Vineland that doesn't really make fun of people who live that way, and that is all they have, but that gets at just how sinister life can actually be for so many people. And there's this sense of what a disaster this is. He's going to one place, he's told he needs to go somewhere else. The details around that are hilarious at times. And we gradually meet Zoid's daughter Prairie. We see they live in this trailer up near Vineland out in the woods. They have a dog, Desmond. We meet other characters around them. But ultimately it becomes clear that some nemesis of Zoid's from his past, Brock Vaughn, who represents the machination of state violence, is coming for him again. And so in order to protect his daughter Prairie, who's a teenager, he sends her off. There are numerous hilarious moments. A whole bit where a sort of punk rock type band, almost like anti-band, Billy Barf and the Vomitones, go and play an Italian wedding that is unbelievably funny. There are details about pouring just the worst cereals from my childhood of those about a decade older than me. But gradually we find out what's going on with Prairie's mother and Zoid's ex-wife, Fernessie, who Brock Vaughn is sort of obsessed over as well. And as Pynchon notes, one of the changes in the 1980s was the Reagan Revolution to undo all sorts of aspects of the Great Society, and even in some ways the new trying to turn the clock back on FDR's New Deal as well. And so the government budgets are being reduced, but that includes just ending all sorts of payments for all sorts of federal programs, including witness protection type payments. And so as Fernessie has this experience, this is her realization. It was there, gazing down a long aisle of frozen food, out past the checkout stands and into the terminal black glow of the front windows, that she found herself entering a moment of undeniable clairvoyance, rare in her life, but recognized. She understood that the Reaganomic axe blades were swinging everywhere, that she and Flash were no longer exempt, might easily be abandoned already to the upper world, and any unfinished business in it that might now resume. As if they'd been kept safe in some time-free zone all these years, but now, at the unreadable whim of something in power, must re-enter the clockwork of cause and effect. Someplace there would be a real axe, or something just as painful, Jasonic, blade to meet final. But at the distance she, Flash, and Justin had by now been brought to. It would all be done with keys on alphanumeric keyboards that stood for weightless, invisible chains of electronic presence or absence. If patterns of ones and zeros were like patterns of human lives and deaths, if everything about an individual could be represented in a computer record by a long string of ones and zeros, then what kind of creature would be represented by a long string of lives and deaths? It would have to be up one level at least, an angel, a minor god, something in a UFO. It would take 8 human lives and deaths just to form one character in this being's name. Its complete dossier might take up a considerable piece of the history of the world. We are digits in God's computer. She not so much thought as hummed to herself, to a sort of standard gospel tune. And the only thing we're good for, to be dead or to be living, is the only thing he sees. What we cry, what we contend for in our world of toil and blood, it all lies beneath the notice of the hacker we call God. And this idea of purpose, of this sense of feeling so small. And the way that the digital age was even then starting to dehumanize people, a theme that David Foster Wallace explored in The Pale King, is something that is very important for Pynchon across Vineland. He gives us these lives in 1984, and he shows us who these people are and how their lives are sort of all being upended, not by their own doing, but by suddenly a change in the structure that has sort of maintained them on this plateau or in this pond, and suddenly a dam bursts and the water's flooding out or new water is flooding in. An isthmus is raised, and suddenly new predators are able to come onto this island. Their entire world is changing, and he then pulls it back to reveal what were they like before this. We get to see, Zoid's experiences. We see Furnessi's experiences. We meet Daryl Luis, who's possibly the best character in the book. And the absolute whirlwind of her experiences. There's a 60-page chapter that just unspools decades of her life, years and years of the different things she has undergone. We get explicit connections to Against the Day, with Furnesi being revealed, and it's not a spoiler or anything, as a descendant of the Traverse family who dominate the second half of Against the Day. And so we see all of these different characters and who they are, what their lives are like. And we have passages like that where we see how they've been reduced and made to feel small. And then Pynchon allows them to start to feel large again, to find the way where they allow themselves to feel large as agents in their own lives, who get to make their own decisions. And so that there is this beating heart in Vineland that I think really does make it compelling and makes it a fascinating and important book. But it's also a book where Pynchon is I think in some ways fearless, with this sense of indicting the world around him, and specifically the culture around him. And there's two passages I think that reveal that. One is in sort of Furnesi and DL's past, where they were part of this group of in this 1960s that were constantly filming what was going on and the acts of violence. And they note, they particularly believed in the ability of close-ups to reveal and devastate. When power corrupts, it keeps a log of its progress, written into that most sensitive memory device, the human face. Who could withstand the light? What viewer could believe in the war, the system, the countless lies about American freedom, looking into these mugshots of the bought and sold, hearing the synchronized voices repeat the same formulas, evasive, effectless, cut off from whatever they had once been by promises of what they would never get to collect on. And that's from an earlier time, but this then is more recent, set for Pynchon. They had both been content to leave it that way, to go along in a government-defined history without consequences, never imagining it could end, turn out to be only another Reaganite dream on the cheap, some snoozy fantasy about kindly character actors in FBI suits, staked out all night long, watching over every poor, scraggly sheep in the herd it was their job to run. The destined losers whose only redemption would have to come through their usefulness to the state law enforcement apparatus, which was calling itself America, although somebody must have known better. And that voice for Pynchon is, I think, strident. He's a bit more explicit than he ever gets in The Crying of Lot 49. He's as explicit as anything he gets at in Gravity's Rainbow. The language he's using here is so much more accessible than Gravity's Rainbow that his point about there continues to be a betrayal of people by powerful individuals, by powerful entities, is something that is here in Vineland. It's present today in the 2020s, and it's something that Pynchon is not afraid to point his light on, and to really examine, why is this happening? Why is it happening to these individuals? And even showing us small snippets of other lives that are affected. And so he can be very direct in Vineland about confronting this sense that the American dream has been betrayed and bought and sold, and that there are people who are permanently affected by that. But as with the heart, I think the heart and the hope and the absolute love that characters have for each other in Vineland is what shines through just as much as this sense of questioning what has happened in the U.S. And I think that's why I would say, read this one, and don't view it as like Pynchon Light or as B plus Pynchon. It has just as much value, it has just as much to say about the condition in the world as any of his other novels, and it's an incredibly accessible book. So let me know. I haven't seen one battle after another, but I understand it's not a total adaptation of the book. I'll be curious to see what the team picked up for this one. But I'd encourage folks to give Vineland a shot. Now that said, Against the Day, I think, is probably still my favorite Pynchon novel, and Vineland goes so well with it. It amplifies and sort of lays the stage for so many themes that Pynchon just wants to explode with in Against the Day. If you've never read this one, and you enjoy Vineland at all, or Rivers Rainbow, dive into Against the Day. It's hilarious. It is denser and longer, but it is a very rewarding read. The Crying of Lot 49 is a great introduction to Pynchon, into the conspiracies. I wouldn't say Vineland has a lot of conspiracies, though there are some unbelievably funny moments with a motorcycle group, the gang that becomes a convent for tax purposes, the Order of Harleyites. I would add, I think David Foster Wallace, both in Infinite Jest with the idea of entertainment and the way that Pynchon is just skewering the time-wasting entertainments that are the breads and circuses of the 20th and 21st centuries, is something that David Foster Wallace was getting at. And even the family and the relational dynamics in Infinite Jest, and certainly The Pale King, the way that The Pale King skewers the same myths about the 1980s in the U.S. as Vineland does. I would say that White Noise by Don DeLillo pairs well with Vineland. I think they explore many of the same ideas while going about it in totally different ways. But the concept of a close nuclear family, consumer culture, and the idea of massive changes at a scope that require people to uproot their lives is a common theme to both. JR by William Gaddis gets at the skewering of absolute greed and consumer culture. There are some ways in which I think The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov pairs well with Vineland, and I'll link my video on this one in the description box below. Philip K. Dick's A Scanner Darkly perhaps works well, especially with the sense of characters who are sort of working for the government and in a life that feels like trapped and things like that. Paul Hoover's Saigon, Illinois gives us a different side of what sort of quiet rebellion could look like in the 1960s or 1970s. This past year I read Memories of the Future by Sigismund Shijanovsky, and some of the ideas in here pair well, especially with the Kahuna Airlines flight that Pynchon describes, where they've got this whole like bar set up and they get periodically stopped in airspace, and then people are just abducted off of it, seemingly by some other human entity, not a UFO entity, but it's unclear. I would note that John Dos Passos' USA trilogy, primarily because of what he does with the camera eye and the newsreel and the biography sections, I think Pynchon is sort of inspired by those. He writes those ideas in a much more straightforward way, and the biography sections are really biographies of fictional characters, not real characters, real humans, as they are in the USA trilogy. But I think there's something he's getting from there. A very different idea of what it means to, like, what one would do for family would be The Road by Cormac McCarthy. And also More Than Human by Theodore Sturgeon, and sort of the great sort of next step in human evolution. But I'll add, there is a wonderful and hilarious connection to Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities, where one of the films described, and the way that Pynchon describes the made-for-TV movies that are showing it's like a made-for-TV movie of the most recent NBA Finals. And one Easter egg there is who Pynchon notes playing Larry Bird, someone who's in the One Battle After Another film. But the idea that we people have been so numb they have to watch the sports event and then they want to watch a movie of a sports event that happened just months earlier, is sort of one of the deep layer jokes. But another is that there's a story about Robert Musil's life with Pee Wee Herman playing Robert Musil. So, as I said, read Vineland. It's a good one. It's well worth the time, and hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.